In 1943, thousands of Italian soldiers were captured in North Africa, starving, sick, and defeated. They'd spent months fighting in the brutal desert heat with almost no food, watching their comrades die from hunger and disease. 6 months later, these same men were dancing with American girls in San Francisco, eating spaghetti at church dinners in Utah, and writing letters home describing their captivity as paradise. This is one of the most remarkable and least known stories of World War II, and it reveals something extraordinary about American hospitality, the Geneva Convention, and what happens when enemies become guests. By the end of this video, you'll discover why 90% of Italian prisoners volunteered to work for the Allies after Italy switched sides, how Catholic churches across America became unlikely centers of cultural exchange during wartime, and why these men faced a heartbreaking choice when they returned to a devastated Italy in 1946. This isn't just history. It's a story about humanity in the middle of the world's deadliest conflict, and it's been hiding in plain sight for 80 years. If you want to hear more forgotten World War II stories like this one, go ahead and tap that like button. It helps other history lovers discover these incredible tales. Now, here's what makes this story so fascinating. We've all heard about German prisoners of war in America. That's relatively well documented, but over 51,000 Italian POWs were held in camps across the United States between 1942 and 1946, and their experience was completely different. The numbers tell part of the story. At the peak in May 1945, there were 50,273 Italian prisoners in camps from Texas to California, from Florida to New Jersey. But what happened inside those camps, and especially what happened when Italian-American communities got involved, created something historians still debate today. A prisoner of war experience so positive that survivors used the word paradise over and over again in their testimonies. Let me set the scene for you, because understanding where these men came from makes the paradise description even more stunning. Picture the North Africa campaign from 1940 to 1943. Italian soldiers were fighting alongside Germany in some of the harshest conditions imaginable. The desert heat was relentless. Supply lines were constantly disrupted. Food was scarce, not just limited, but genuinely scarce to the point of starvation. One grandson of an Italian POW who was captured at the Mareth line in Tunisia described his grandfather's experience this way. While he was fighting in North Africa, he was hungry and living in horrible conditions. The contrast with what came next makes this the foundation of the entire paradise narrative. When the Allies launched their final offensives in Tunisia and Libya in late 1942 and early 1943, thousands of Italian soldiers were captured. They were transported to the United States, and almost immediately, they noticed something different. They were being fed, not just adequately, but abundantly. They were given a pack of cigarettes every single day, a luxury many of them hadn't seen in months. They slept in warm barracks instead of tents in the desert. And most importantly, they were treated with basic human dignity under the Geneva Convention of 1929. Now, I need you to drop a comment if you've ever had a family member who was a prisoner of war in any conflict, or if you have Italian heritage and might have connections to this story. The number of people who discover family connections to these events is remarkable, and I'd love to hear your stories. Here's where the story takes its most dramatic turn. On September 8, 1943, Italy formally surrendered to the Allies through the Armistice of Cassabili. Suddenly, Italian prisoners of war in America faced a choice that would define their entire experience for the next 3 years. The United States military established something called the Italian Service Units. a voluntary work program that allowed POWs to transition from prisoner status to what they called co-belligerent workers. Essentially, they could volunteer to actively support the Allied war effort against their former Axis partners. The participation rate was extraordinary. Approximately 45,000 Italian POWs volunteered for the Italian service units. That's roughly 90% of all eligible prisoners. Think about that for a moment. 9 out of 10 men chose to volunteer. This wasn't coerced. The Geneva Convention strictly prohibited forcing POWs to work against their own country's interests. This was a genuine choice, and the overwhelming majority said yes. Why such high participation? The benefits were significant and tangible. ISU volunteers received better housing than standard POWs. They were provided with proper uniforms. They received actual pay for their labor, not prison wages, but compensation that allowed them to send money home or save for after the war. Most crucially, they gained significantly more freedom and privileges than standard prisoner status allowed. They could interact with local communities. They could attend church services. In some cases, especially out west, they had freedoms that would seem unthinkable for prisoners of war. The work itself varied widely. Italian service unit members worked at army depots and supply centers across the country. They staffed arsenals and ordnance facilities. Many worked in military hospitals providing care and support. Others did agricultural work on farms experiencing severe labor shortages due to American men being overseas. Some worked on construction and maintenance projects. 10,350 ISU members were even deployed to France to support operations there. 28,000 were prepared for Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France. These weren't passive prisoners sitting out the war. They became active participants on the Allied side. If you're finding this story as fascinating as I am, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because I'm covering more hidden World War II stories that never made it into the textbooks. Now let's talk about the camps themselves, because the geographic distribution created very different experiences depending on where you were held. 15 major camps across the United States held Italian prisoners, and 3 of them were exclusively or primarily Italian. Camp Hereford in Texas held only Italians. Camp Belle Meade in New Jersey was primarily Italian. Camp Weingarten in Missouri was also primarily Italian. Other significant camps included Fort Bliss in Texas. That's where Simona's grandfather from the testimonials was held, along with Camp Blanding in Florida, Camp Florence in Arizona, Camp McCain in Mississippi, and numerous others scattered across the country. But here's where geography becomes crucial to understanding the hospitality phenomenon. The experience varied significantly by region, and this is where the story gets really interesting. On the East Coast, interactions were more reserved and formal. Guards and civilians maintained stricter adherence to regulations. There wasn't as much civilian contact, and the prisoner experience, while humane, was more by the book. Move to the Midwest and things started to shift. The atmosphere was unofficially more permissive. Connections with Italian-American communities began to grow. There was moderate social integration, especially in areas with established Italian populations. But California and the West Coast, that's where the paradise description really came to life. The hospitality there was most enthusiastic and welcoming. Italian-American communities didn't just acknowledge the POWs, they actively engaged with them. The level of freedom granted was remarkable, even shocking by modern POW standards. And this is where we get to one of my favorite examples that perfectly illustrates just how different this experience was. Italian POWs stationed at Angel Island in San Francisco Bay, a facility that's more famous for being an immigration station, rented a dance hall in San Francisco with their own money. Let that sink in for a second. Prisoners of war, during an active global conflict, renting a dance hall with money they'd earned. They held regular dances where they could socialize, meet people, and interact with the Italian-American community. This wasn't some one-time special event. It was regular. It was part of their lives as POWs. Think about what this means in practical terms. These men were earning wages from their work in the Italian service units, actual American dollars that they could spend or save. They had enough freedom of movement that they could leave Angel Island, cross the bay, and make arrangements to rent commercial space in San Francisco. They had enough trust from their American supervisors that this was permitted, even encouraged. And they had enough connection with the local Italian-American community that people actually attended these dances. Young women came. Families came. It was genuine social integration happening in the middle of World War II. The California experience extended to numerous locations where Italian service units were stationed, and each location tells its own story. At Birmingham Hospital in Van Nuys, Italian POWs worked alongside American medical staff, providing care for wounded soldiers. At Fort Ord on the Monterey Peninsula, they performed essential support functions that freed up American troops for combat duty. Camp Cook and Camp Roberts, both in Central California, became major ISU centers where thousands of Italian volunteers worked on everything from vehicle maintenance to food service. At Camp San Luis Obispo, POWs worked on construction projects that expanded the facility's capacity. McClellan Field in Sacramento and Stockton Field saw Italian mechanics and technicians working on aircraft and equipment. Hamilton Field in Marin County, just north of San Francisco, became another hub of ISU activity. At each of these locations, the interaction between POWs and local communities created bonds that would last long after the war ended. Italian Americans in these California towns saw the ISU members not as prisoners, but as paesani, countrymen. They invited them to family dinners. They introduced them to their daughters, which, yes, sometimes led to romances and marriages. They helped them send letters and packages back to families in Italy. They shared news from the old country and helped these men maintain their cultural identity even while they were prisoners thousands of miles from home. This wasn't just tolerance or basic humanitarian treatment. This was genuine welcome, genuine hospitality, genuine community integration in a way that seems almost impossible from a modern perspective on how prisoners of war should be treated. Now, we need to talk about the role of Catholic churches, because this is where cultural connection and community hospitality really came together in a powerful way. Across the country, there was an outpouring of interest from Italian Americans who were looking in the POW camps for relatives, family, friends, or simply people from their hometowns back in Italy. Remember, many Italian Americans had immigrated in the previous generation. They still had strong connections to specific regions, towns, even individual villages in Italy. The idea that someone from their hometown might be in a nearby POW camp created an emotional pull that transcended the politics of war. This wasn't abstract sentiment. It was deeply personal. An Italian-American family from Calabria might search prisoner rosters looking for anyone from their village. Someone from Sicily would ask camp administrators if any POWs were from Palermo or Catania. The geographic specificity mattered enormously. Italy isn't a monolith. Regional identities are powerful, and dialects can vary so much between regions that they're almost different languages. Finding someone from your specific area of Italy meant finding someone who spoke your dialect, who knew your traditions, who understood your particular corner of Italian culture. It meant finding a piece of home. Catholic parishes in many states arranged to host dinners where Italian Americans could meet and visit with Italian POWs. These weren't just generic meet and greets. These were full Italian meals, often featuring the exact foods these men had been dreaming about since leaving home. And yes, that includes spaghetti. Multiple sources confirm that Italian POWs were served spaghetti and traditional Italian dishes at church dinners organized by local Italian-American communities. We're talking about authentic pasta, properly cooked al dente, with red sauce made from family recipes that had been brought over from Italy. We're talking about meatballs, braciole, sausages. We're talking about crusty bread, wine. In some communities, yes, wine was served despite Prohibition-era attitudes that still influenced many areas. We're talking about multi-course meals that started with antipasti, moved through pasta courses, included meat dishes, and ended with desserts like tiramisu or cannoli. For men who had been eating military rations, even good American military rations, getting authentic Italian food prepared by people who knew how to cook it properly was profoundly meaningful. Military food is designed for nutrition and efficiency. It's not designed to taste like home. It's not designed to evoke memories of Sunday dinners with your family, of feast days and celebrations, of your mother's kitchen or your grandmother's cooking. These church dinners provided all of that. They provided sensory connection to home through taste and smell. They provided emotional connection through the act of sharing a meal with people who understood what that meal meant culturally. And they provided spiritual connection through the setting. Catholic churches that held services in Italian, with priests who often spoke the language and understood the religious traditions these men had grown up with. One of the best documented examples comes from Ogden, Utah. The local church held chaperone dances each weekend specifically for POWs. Italian-American families could visit the prisoners on Sundays. There were regular social events facilitated through the parish that created ongoing cultural connections. This wasn't a one-time humanitarian gesture. It was an ongoing relationship between the Italian-American community and these prisoners who represented their cultural heritage. Let me paint a picture of what one of these weekend dances in Ogden might have looked like, based on the historical accounts. It's Saturday evening, probably around 7 o'clock. The church hall has been decorated, maybe some Italian and American flags, some flowers, tables set up around the perimeter of the room. There's a phonograph playing music, probably a mix of American swing and Italian songs. Italian service unit members arrive wearing their uniforms, cleaned and pressed for the occasion. They've been looking forward to this all week. Young Italian-American women arrive with their families, and this is crucial. They arrive with chaperones because this is 1943 and 44, and propriety still matters enormously, especially in religious communities. Parents are present. Older siblings are present. Parish priests are present. Everything is supervised and proper. But within that structure, real social interaction happens. The POWs dance with local girls. They speak Italian with families who are hungry for conversation in their native language. They share news from Italy, talk about their hometowns, discover shared connections. Sometimes they find actual family connections. A POW from Naples discovers that someone's cousin's wife is from the same neighborhood. An Italian-American family from Genoa meets a prisoner whose uncle lived on the same street their grandfather came from. These 6 degrees of separation moments happened frequently because the Italian immigrant community in America was large enough to be significant, but still connected enough that shared origins created instant bonds. And every Sunday, the pattern repeats with visits to the camp. Italian-American families arrive with food, always food. They bring home-cooked meals to supplement what the POWs are getting in the camp. They bring Italian newspapers if they can find them. They bring Catholic religious items, rosaries, prayer cards, small medals of saints. They bring letters to deliver to families in Italy through Red Cross channels. They bring photographs to share. They bring news from the community. They bring, most essentially, the message that these men haven't been forgotten, that they're valued, that their cultural identity matters and is being preserved even in this strange circumstance of being prisoners of war thousands of miles from home. The food element goes beyond just spaghetti, though that's certainly symbolic. These church dinners featured Italian feasts, multiple courses, wine in some cases, the kind of meals that took hours to prepare and were meant to be savored over conversation. The Italian-American hosts wanted to provide comfort food, yes, but more than that, they wanted to provide home. They wanted these men to feel, even for a few hours, like they were back in Italy, surrounded by people who understood their language, their culture, their experience. And here's something that really drives home how meaningful this was: the preparation that went into these dinners. Italian-American women would spend days preparing these meals. They'd start early in the morning on the day of the dinner, or even the day before. Making pasta sauce from scratch meant slow cooking tomatoes for hours to develop the right depth of flavor. Making meatballs meant carefully mixing ground meat with breadcrumbs soaked in milk, with eggs, with Parmesan cheese, with fresh parsley and garlic, then hand-rolling each one. Making braciole meant pounding out thin pieces of beef, filling them with breadcrumbs and cheese and herbs, rolling them up and tying them with string, then slow braising them in the sauce. This wasn't convenience food. This wasn't opening a can. This was labor-intensive cooking that required skill, time, and expensive ingredients during a period of wartime rationing. That's another layer to this story that's easy to miss. These Italian-American families were cooking these elaborate feasts during a time when many ingredients were rationed or hard to find. Meat was rationed, sugar was rationed, coffee was rationed. Butter and cheese were often scarce. But for these dinners, families pooled their ration stamps. They used their precious allotments. They sacrificed other meals during the week so they could serve abundance on the day the POWs came to the parish hall. That sacrifice represented how deeply they valued this connection, how important it was to them to share their culture and provide hospitality to these young men who represented their heritage. Let me give you a sense of what daily life was like for an Italian service unit member versus a standard POW. A standard prisoner of war under the Geneva Convention received adequate food. The convention required rations equivalent to those of the captor's troops. They got medical care, shelter, protection from the elements, and the right to send and receive mail. They had access to religious services. The United States generally met these requirements and often exceeded them. But an ISU volunteer experienced something qualitatively different. Yes, they got the abundant food that so many testimonials mention. And remember, abundant is relative to the starvation they'd experienced in North Africa. They got that pack of cigarettes daily, which sounds minor, but represented a significant quality of life improvement. They slept in comfortable barracks. But beyond the material conditions, they had freedom of movement that regular POWs didn't have. They could leave the camp for work assignments. They could interact with civilians. They could attend community events. In the more permissive locations, especially California, they could even pursue romantic relationships. And that brings us to one of the most remarkable aspects of this story: the romances and war brides. American women and Italian POWs formed romantic relationships during this period. Some of these relationships led to marriages after the war. According to the historical accounts, American women actually sailed to Italy to marry former POWs and then returned to the United States together. Think about the courage that required on both sides. For the women, traveling to a war-devastated country to marry someone they'd met under extraordinary circumstances. For the men, proposing marriage, knowing they'd have to take their new wives back to an Italy that had been bombed, occupied, and was facing economic collapse. The dance halls, the church socials, the work assignments that brought POWs into contact with American families, all of these created opportunities for human connection that went well beyond what anyone would expect from a prisoner of war program. These weren't illicit relationships or violations of protocol. In many cases, Italian-American families could obtain official permission to take ISU members out of camps for picnics and outings. The system actively facilitated this cultural exchange. Now, I've linked some additional resources in the description, including information about the documentary Prisoners in Paradise by Camilla Calamandre. If you want to hear first-hand accounts from survivors, that's an excellent place to start. Let's talk about why this story matters and why it's so much less known than the German POW experience. First, the numbers are substantial but not as large. 51,000 Italian POWs versus more German prisoners who were also held in the United States. Second, the German POW story fit more neatly into post-war narratives about denazification and redemption. Third, and this is crucial, the Italian experience was complicated by Italy switching sides mid-war. That created a unique category, co-belligerent workers, that doesn't fit neatly into standard war narratives. But this story demonstrates something profoundly important about the effectiveness of international humanitarian law. The Geneva Convention of 1929 established rules for POW treatment, humane treatment at all times, adequate food, medical care, shelter, work rules with compensation, religious freedom, and communication rights. The United States didn't just meet these requirements, they exceeded them, particularly for the Italian service units. This created a prisoner of war experience that stood in stark contrast to what was happening in other theaters of the war. The cultural bridge element is equally significant. Italian-American communities saw these POWs not as enemies, but as connections to their heritage. They saw young men who could have been their cousins, their nephews, their neighbors, if circumstances had been different. That cultural and familial identification transformed what could have been a purely military operation into a human exchange that enriched both groups. And then there's the timing. By late 1943, when the ISU program was in full swing, Italy had switched sides. These weren't enemy prisoners anymore in the traditional sense. They were from a country that was now fighting against Germany alongside the Allies. That political shift changed the entire dynamic and made the high level of trust and freedom possible. But we need to acknowledge something more complex here. Not all Italians supported the Allied side after the armistice. Italy experienced a civil war in the final years of World War II. The North remained under fascist control with German support. The Italian Social Republic, also called the Republic of Salo. The South was controlled by the Allied-backed Italian government. Families were divided. Brothers fought on opposite sides. The Italian POWs in America had made a choice by volunteering for the ISU program. They were choosing the Allied side, choosing to support the overthrow of Mussolini's fascism, choosing to work actively against German interests. That choice had real consequences for their families back in Italy, especially those in German-occupied territories. Some POWs didn't volunteer for the ISU program. That 10% who chose to remain standard prisoners had their reasons. Some remained loyal to Mussolini's fascist ideology. Some feared reprisals against their families in occupied Italy. Some simply didn't want to take sides in what they saw as a political conflict beyond their control. The fact that we focus on the 90% who volunteered shouldn't erase the complexity of the 10% who didn't. Their choice was also valid, also principled in its own way, and also protected under the Geneva Convention, which prohibited forcing POWs to take up arms against their own country. If you know someone who'd be interested in this story, do me a favor and share this video with them. These hidden histories deserve to be known. Now we need to talk about the ending, because it brings the paradise description into sharp, painful focus. In January 1946, mass repatriation of Italian POWs began. They returned to Naples, Italy, and what they found was devastating. Cities and infrastructure had been destroyed by years of warfare. The Italian economy had collapsed. There was severe poverty and massive unemployment across the country. Food shortages meant many Italians were facing genuine hunger and strict rationing. Political instability created uncertainty as the country transitioned from fascism to a new government. Everything was in chaos. Let me give you specific details about what Italy looked like in early 1946, because the contrast with their American experience needs to be understood in concrete terms. Naples, where most POWs landed upon repatriation, had been heavily bombed. The port facilities were damaged. Buildings throughout the city showed blast damage and shell holes. Unexploded ordnance littered many areas, making simple activities like walking through rubble-strewn streets dangerous. The city's infrastructure, water, electricity, sewage, functioned sporadically at best. Many neighborhoods had no running water. Rolling blackouts were common. Garbage collection had collapsed, creating public health hazards. The economic situation was catastrophic. The Italian lira had lost most of its value. Hyperinflation meant that whatever money people had saved was essentially worthless. The black market dominated economic life because official channels couldn't provide basic necessities. Unemployment was massive. Some estimates suggested that more than half of working-age men couldn't find jobs. The industries that had employed people before the war were destroyed or dismantled. Agriculture was disrupted by 2 years of warfare moving up and down the peninsula. Food production had dropped dramatically. Hunger was real and widespread. Italians were receiving significantly fewer calories per day than the Geneva Convention had required for POWs. Think about that irony for a moment. These men had been POWs, and they'd been fed better as prisoners in America than their families had been fed as civilians in Italy. Bread was rationed at levels far below what people needed to feel full. Meat was almost impossible to obtain through legitimate channels. Fresh fruits and vegetables were scarce. The abundant food these men had experienced in America, 3 meals a day, plenty of bread, meat regularly, that pack of cigarettes daily. All of that was now a memory as they faced genuine food insecurity in their own homeland. Imagine the psychological whiplash. These men had spent 2 to 3 years in the United States being fed abundantly, earning wages, enjoying social freedoms, and experiencing peace and safety. They'd gotten used to electric lights that worked consistently, hot running water, flush toilets, heat in winter, medical care when they needed it, social activities, music, dancing, romance in some cases, a sense of normalcy despite being prisoners. And then they stepped off the ship in Naples to a nightmare landscape of destruction, deprivation, and despair. The family reunions were bittersweet at best. Yes, they were grateful to be home, grateful to see loved ones who had survived. But what they found wasn't the Italy they remembered. Family members had aged dramatically under the stress. Children had grown up without fathers and uncles. Wives had struggled alone. Parents had suffered. Homes had been destroyed or damaged. Communities had been torn apart by civil war divisions between fascists and partisans. Old neighbors wouldn't speak to each other because of political choices made during the war. The social fabric of Italian life had been ripped apart, and it would take years, maybe generations, to repair. This contrast explains why some former POWs sought to return to the United States after the war. It explains the lasting positive memories of American hospitality that survivors carried for the rest of their lives. It explains why, decades later, when historians and filmmakers interviewed these men, the word paradise kept appearing in their testimonies. It wasn't exaggeration or propaganda, it was their lived experience, especially when viewed against the backdrop of what came before in North Africa and what came after in post-war Italy. The post-war immigration connections are harder to document specifically, but the pattern makes sense. Strong bonds had been formed with Italian-American communities during the POW period. War brides created direct family links between Italy and the United States. Former POWs returned to an Italy with limited economic opportunities while remembering an America where they'd been treated with dignity and had seen prosperity. Established community networks from the POW period provided potential sponsorship and support for immigration. While specific documented cases of former POWs sponsoring relatives' immigration are scarce in the available research, the logical connections are clear. Let me recap what you've learned in the last 30 minutes. You now know about the 51,000 Italian prisoners of war who were held in the United States during World War II, and how their experience was uniquely positive compared to other POW situations. You discovered why 90% of them volunteered for the Italian service units after Italy switched sides in September 1943. You learned about the extraordinary hospitality they received, especially from Italian-American communities and Catholic parishes who organized dinners, dances, and social events that connected these prisoners to their cultural heritage. You heard about the romances that formed, the war brides who followed their loves across the ocean, and the freedoms these men experienced, from earning wages to renting dance halls in San Francisco. And you understood the heartbreaking contrast between their paradise experience in America and the devastated Italy they returned to in January 1946. You started this video maybe thinking you knew World War II history. You now understand a hidden chapter that reveals something beautiful about humanity, even in the darkest times. That cultural connection, hospitality, and simple human decency can transform enemies into friends, prisoners into guests, and create memories of paradise in the middle of war. Here's what I want you to do next. First, hit that subscribe button because I'm diving deep into more forgotten World War II stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about the war. Second, check the description for links to additional resources, including the Prisoners in Paradise documentary and historical archives. Third, and this is important, talk to your older relatives if you have Italian heritage. Ask about family connections to World War II. You might discover that your grandfather, great-uncle, or family friend was part of this incredible story. In my next video, I'm revealing another hidden World War II tale that's even more surprising than this one. The story of how thousands of American soldiers became fluent in Japanese in just 18 months, using a secret language school in Minnesota, and how that program changed the course of the Pacific War. It's a story of linguistic genius, cultural immersion, and intelligence operations that remained classified for decades. Until then, remember that history isn't just dates and battles. It's human stories of dignity, connection, and unexpected grace in the most unlikely circumstances. I'll see you in the next one.